So in this lecture, we're going to talk about social psychology. So we'll start off by going through the basis of social psychology. What is it? Then we'll move on to social influence, where we'll discuss things like conformity and obedience. Next, we'll talk about helping and harming others, so both pro-social and antisocial or aggressive behaviors. We'll talk about the origins of attitudes and persuasion. And we're going to end up with the very timely subject of prejudice and discrimination, how it originates, and even some ways to remedy it. So let's get started. According to psychologist Gordon Allport, social psychology uses scientific methods to understand and explain how thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of other human beings. Essentially, social psychology is about understanding how each person's individual behaviors are influenced by the social environment in which those behaviors take place. So you probably already realize that other people can have a dramatic influence on the way you act and the choices that you make. Consider how you might behave in a situation if you were all alone versus if there were other people in the room. The decisions you make and the behaviors you exhibit might depend on not only how many people are present, but exactly who you're around. So you're likely to behave much differently when you're surrounded by a group of close friends than you would if you were sitting in a classroom or a group of colleagues or supervisors from work. It's important to note that social psychology is not just about looking at social influences. Social perception and social interaction are also vital to understanding social behaviors. So the way that we see other people and the way that they see us can play a powerful role in a wide variety of actions and decisions. So again, think for a moment about how you might act differently in a public setting if you were home by yourself. So if you're home, you might be loud and rambunctious, while in public, you might be subdued and reserved. Why is this? Well, the people around us shape our thoughts, feelings, mood, attitudes, and perception. And the presence of other people can make a difference in the choices we make and the actions we take. Humans are a social species. We gravitate towards each other and we're predisposed to form smaller, intimate, interpersonal networks. So, though we might have hundreds or thousands of friends on our social media accounts, the approximate size of a human social group is much smaller than that, probably closer to about 150 people. And this is around the average number of people that know us reasonably well: friends, families, colleagues, coworkers, etc. One explanation for why we form these groups is the need to belong theory, which is the idea that we have biologically based needs for interpersonal connection. It's useful for us to have friends and family. Even the threat of social isolation can promote unhealthy behavior and compromise things such as our IQ scores. Social exclusion also activates the same brain areas as physical pain. So, the anterior cingulate cortex, for example, which is responsible for the emotional component of pain sensations, actually lights up in the same way when we're isolated or rejected as when we stub our toe or get hit by something. In other words, humans are such profoundly social creatures that it literally hurts us to be isolated or rejected. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on when we talk about aggression. Humans have evolved to be the highly social species that we are because most social influence processes are adaptive under many circumstances. It's beneficial to us to have social groups that are close to us, family members and peers that we can lean on and who support us. But these sources of influence can turn maladaptive when we follow them blindly or without question. Some famous and large-scale examples of this are things like the Holocaust, genocides in Rwanda and Darfur, and that's just on a broad scale. This is true on a much smaller scale too, like succumbing to peer pressure and behaving in ways you know you shouldn't. So it's important to remember that social influences should always be evaluated critically. Because we are a social species, it shouldn't come as a surprise that we use our relationships as a way to compare and evaluate ourselves. Our social networks serve as a mirror to provide information about ourselves compared to others. Social comparison theory suggests that we seek to evaluate our beliefs, attitudes, and abilities by comparing our reactions with other people. People consistently evaluate themselves and others in domains like attractiveness, wealth, intelligence, and success. According to some studies, as much as 10% of our thoughts involve comparisons of some kind. So, social comparison theory is the idea that individuals determine their own social and personal worth based on how they stack up against others. This theory was developed in 1954 by psychologist Leon Festinger, and later research has shown that people who regularly compare themselves to others may find motivation to improve, but may also experience feelings of deep dissatisfaction, guilt, or remorse, and engage in destructive behaviors like lying or disordered eating. Now, people generally engage in either upward or downward social comparison. So, with downward social comparison, we compare ourselves with people who seem inferior to us in some way, or those who seem below us. Let's use social status as an example. So, if you're a very popular high school student, comparing yourself to the less popular kids in your grade is a form of downward social comparison because in the grand scheme of the social network, those students are below you. Upwards social comparison is the opposite. So comparing ourselves to people who seem superior to us or above us in some way. So using the same example as before, this would be comparing ourselves to someone who's even more popular than we are. Research, unsurprisingly, finds that downward social comparisons make us feel better about ourselves. But there's danger to each approach, such as insecurity and jealousy, or overconfidence and arrogance. We see social comparison quite a bit in social media research. So think about some of the primary motivations for browsing on social media. Maybe you're bored, but maybe you're also looking through to see what else is going on in your peer group. What are your friends up to? What have they been doing? There's been quite a bit of research on something called lurking, which is where you're just sort of purposely scrolling through social media sites just to see what's going on. But think about the pictures that we post. You're not going to post a picture of yourself looking absolutely awful where you're wearing, a ripped t-shirt and your hair is a mess. You're going to post that super cute picture where your hair was looking good that day. Maybe you did your makeup nicely, or you are at the beach and showing what a great time you're having. So the images that we tend to post on our social media page are highly sanitized and filtered, and probably not all that indicative of realism. But if you think about early adolescents who are spending a lot of time comparing themselves to their friends on social media, we can run into some big problems where they start to feel like they can never measure up. And in fact, there's been a handful of cases recently where things have gotten so extreme that students have committed suicide after feeling like they can't possibly live up to their peers' lives and expectations. Let's take a look at an example of social comparison theory from the movie The Devil Wears Prada. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the rough premise is that there's a writer named Andy, who is played by Anne Hathaway, who doesn't care at all about fashion and ends up working for a highly prestigious fashion magazine run by Miranda Priestly, who's played by Meryl Streep. Emily, who is played by Emily Blunt, and Nigel, who's played by Stanley Tucci, one of my favorite actors, incidentally, both work for Miranda. So let's take a quick look at the clip.
Right, remember you and I have totally different jobs. I mean, you get coffee, run errands. I'm in charge of her schedule, her appointments, and her expenses, and most importantly, I get to go with her to Paris for Fashion Week in the fall. I get to wear couture, I get to all the shows and all the parties, I meet all of the designers. It's fine. Okay, now stay here. I'm going to the art department to give them the book. This is the book. Now it is a mock-up of everything in the current issue. And we deliver it to Miranda's apartment every night. And she returns it to us in the morning and next. Yeah. Second assistant is supposed to do this, but Miranda is very private and she does not like strangers in her house until she decides that you're not a total psycho. I get the lovely task of waiting around for the book. Oh, Emily, what do I deal with it?
So how is this an example of downward social comparison? Well, think about who has the social power in this interaction. Emily is comparing herself to Andy in a way that makes Emily seem vastly superior. I am the first assistant. I get to go to Paris. It's absolutely divine. Emily is reevaluating her own beliefs, attitudes, and abilities about herself and her job by comparing herself to Andy, who she believes to be below her. Just as we look to others to compare and evaluate ourselves, we also look to others when the situation is ambiguous to determine what to believe and how we should act. And this can be problematic. So, one example is mass hysteria, or the outbreak of irrational beliefs that's spread by social contagion. Social contagion refers to the tendency for people to mimic the behavior of others who are either nearby or who they've been exposed to. It suggests that behaviors are catchy, and we use this insight and theory to our advantage during turbulent and life-threatening times. Social contagion is critical to keep in mind as we witness both the very good and very bad behavior of people in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, we've seen remarkable evidence of people tapping into the better parts of their nature with inspiring acts of kindness, generosity, compassion, and assistance to others. Neighbors helping the most vulnerable in their communities, donations of much needed medical supplies to those in need, and healthcare professionals treating the sick even without adequate protective gear. It's not only inspiring to witness these acts of kindness and compassion, but according to social contagion theory, it's catchy also. It models how we could all act if so desired. Think about it. If you start to hear stories of people doing good things, doesn't it make you want to go out and do them too? Now, on the other side, we have seen acts of social contagion where behavior taps into the negative sides of our nature. For example, when people hoard much needed supplies such as food and toilet paper, or when people act in frustrated and angry ways with grocery store clerks and others, or when people ignore public health advice regarding staying home and social distancing, evidenced by the flood of spring break students frolicking in Florida who are endangering themselves as well as those who they come in contact with. These behaviors also act as a form of social contagion, where others follow the herd engaging in self-centered and risky behavior that increases threats and harm. So that mentality of, well, if everybody else is doing it, why can't or why shouldn't I? So we've talked about a few examples where social influence can have a negative influence on us, but let's think now about some times where social influence can be positive. One of these is social facilitation, and so this is where the mere presence of others enhances our performance. Many of you are probably athletes or like to engage in physical activity of some sort. You've probably experienced social facilitation without even noticing it, or that feeling where a rush or a crowd of people watching makes you perform better. Perhaps the first social psychology laboratory experiment was undertaken in this area by Norman Triplett in 1898. In his research on the speed records of cyclists, he noticed that racing against each other rather than against the clock alone increased cyclists' speeds. He then attempted to duplicate this finding under laboratory conditions using children and fishing reels. So there were two conditions, a child alone or children in pairs but working alone. And the task was to wind the fishing line in a given amount of time. And what Triplett found was that children worked faster in the presence of a partner doing the same task. His experiments demonstrate the co-action effect, which refers to a phenomenon where increased task performance comes about by the mere presence of others doing the same task. You ever been on the treadmill at the gym and you look over and you see the person next to you is going fast? Doesn't that make you want to speed up so that you can keep up with them?
Do you ever wonder why you seem to work more effectively in a library or a quiet cafe than at your own desk at home? You might have encountered a phenomenon called social facilitation. In this video, we are going to explore this extremely prevalent social psychological phenomena that has yet been widely overlooked by many of us. Social facilitation can be defined as an improvement in individual performance when there is someone else around doing the same task rather than doing it alone, or by the mere presence of others. The influence of other people in your surroundings is significant on your own performance. However, this does not mean that they all lead to better performance of your own. Researchers found that one can only improve their performance when doing simple work, which means the work at hand is either habitual without much complexity or already well learned. After all, we can all relate to what the presence of strangers or of an audience can do to us when we're performing something very complex or not well rehearsed. The assumption that having someone else around is spurring our own performance has been tested and confirmed in numerous experiments. In an experiment that dates back to as early as the 19th century, scientists noticed that cyclists performed better when competing against other cyclists than they did against a clock in a time trial. In another experimental setting where children were asked to wind up a fishing line, those who were winding together with other children worked faster than when doing it alone. This phenomenon is not limited to human beings either. Studies also found that pairs and groups of ants will dig more sand per ant than solitary ants. Animals will eat more of their food if there are others of their species present. So why does this happen? What is out there at play that pushes us to perform better with the presence of others rather than simply being left doing things alone? There are a few theories and models developed by researchers that seek to explain the logic behind social facilitation. A dominant argument is that the presence of others serves as a source of arousal that increases our alertness to do better on well-practiced or habitual tasks. The same alertness, however, could slow down performance and act as an impediment when the tasks are less practiced or more complex. Other researchers argue that, instead of the mere presence of other people, other conditions play a role as well. Some believe that it's primarily the fear of being evaluated by the audience that boosts the productivity. In the evaluative situation, we're more inclined to maintain a positive self-image or face in the presence of others. In a less or non-evaluative situation, social facilitation effects were often limited. Some emphasize that individual characteristics are the major variable accounting for social facilitation. People with a positive social orientation react positively to challenges and are more likely to display social facilitation effects. Shortly, people who find safety in numbers. On the contrary, individuals who have low self-esteem will feel inhibited and threatened by the presence of other people, and they tend to experience an impairment in performance. Studies have related the causes of the social facilitation effect with factors such as the task we are performing, whether we are being evaluated, as well as our own personal characters. So what do all these findings imply, and what can we do with it to make our life a bit better? Knowing about social facilitation can help you understand motivation from a new perspective. We often interpret someone's performance based solely on his or her abilities. For example, if a person doesn't perform well on a given task, we might just assume that he or she isn't good at it, or isn't willing to put forth the effort that is needed to do it well. When being observed, motivation is high when performing an easy task. We're likely to get positive feedback as a result. Motivation is lower for more difficult tasks because we fear making mistakes, which could result in unfavorable comments from others. For those who are in leadership positions, the key to using social facilitation effectively is to assign repetitive or habitual tasks in group settings, and put people with complex tasks in an environment where they can solve problems without interference of others. At the individual level, social facilitation allows us to understand more about our own reactions and performance when being exposed to people in different settings. So next time when you have a complex or an easier repetitive task to solve, you can adjust and optimize your environment with the help of social facilitation. Stay productive, stay valorous.
Okay, sorry, I know that voice was a little bit challenging, but I like the video. I think they do a good job of describing social facilitation. So up next, attributions are the process of assigning cause to behaviors. So in other words, why do we act in a certain way? Attribution theory is concerned with how ordinary people explain the causes of behavior and events. So, for example, is someone angry because they're bad-tempered or because something bad happened? In real life, attribution is something we all do every day, usually without any awareness of the underlying processes and biases that lead to our inferences. For example, over the course of a typical day, you probably make numerous attributions about your own behavior as well as that of the people around you. When you get a poor grade on a quiz, you might blame your teacher for not adequately explaining the material, completely dismissing the fact that maybe you didn't study as much as you probably should have. But when a classmate gets a great grade on the same quiz, you might attribute their good performance to luck, neglecting the fact that your friend spent a lot of time studying. Attributions can be internal or external. We call something an internal attribution when we consider it to be something personal or unique to the individual. These internal, or also known as dispositional attributions, are enduring characteristics like personality traits, attitudes, or intelligence. Now, on the other hand, external, also called situational influences, are outside the individual and tend to be more related to circumstances in the environment. Say someone robbed a bank. We'd probably want to know why they did it. What might be an internal attribution? Well, maybe they're an impulsive person. They saw the opportunity for money and just couldn't help themselves. But an external attribution might say, well, maybe they robbed the bank because their family desperately needed the money for medical bills and they were simply at their wits' end and couldn't think of another way to get the money they needed. So why do we make internal attributions for some things while making external attributions for another? Part of this has to do with the type of attribution that we're likely to use in a particular situation. Now, this is known as the fundamental attribution error, which is one of the big kahunas of social psychology. So even though situational variables are likely present, we automatically attribute the cause to internal characteristics. The fundamental attribution error concerns the way we view other people's behavior and involves the tendency to overemphasize internal or personality-based explanations for behaviors while underemphasizing external or situational explanations. In other words, people have a cognitive bias to assume that a person's actions depend on what kind of person they are, rather than the social and environmental forces that influence the person. The fundamental attribution error explains why people often blame other people for things over which they usually have no control. So imagine you're at the airport, you're standing in line, and somebody comes crashing through the line and smashes into you. Your first thought is likely to be, oh, what a rude person. God, they just have no respect for other people. Jeez. But on the other hand, another way to think about that, if we were to make an external attribution, might be this person is really late, they got stuck in traffic, they're really just trying to make their flight, they're trying to get home for their son's football game, something like that. So the fundamental attribution error sort of explains the way that we characterize a situation that occurs. We tend to see others as internally motivated and responsible for their behavior. So the person at the airport, we think, oh, what a rude person. This could be because of perceptual salience. That is, the other person is what we see most of when we look at them. Or it could be that we lack more detailed information about what causes their behavior. So we didn't know that the person was late for their flight. All we know is that, ow, they just smashed into me and it really hurt. Perhaps the saddest example of the tendency to make internal attributions, whether or not they're warranted, is victim blaming. So if giving someone our sympathy or blaming the true culprit somehow causes us dissonance, we may hold the victim responsible for their own pain and suffering, sort of like a he had it coming or she was asking for it mentality. But here's the interesting part. We only do this for other people's behaviors. When it comes to our own behaviors, we're much more likely to involve the situational or internal influences. Well, why might that be? Well, perhaps it's because we're more aware of the circumstances when it's ourselves. We don't need the ability to put ourselves into other people's shoes. So to take the test example, if we were to consider why someone did poorly on a test, we might attribute it to personality or intelligence, or think they're lazy or didn't study enough. If your friend comes to you and says, I failed, you might say, well, how much time did you spend studying? That's the fundamental attribution error at work. But for our own behavior, it's the opposite. So if we did poorly on a test, we might say, that test really wasn't fair. The professor put all sorts of stuff on there that we didn't cover, or I didn't get enough sleep last night because the dog was up barking, making situational or external attributions to explain the behavior. Interestingly, fundamental attribution bias may not be universal across cultures. While American children were found to place increasing reliance upon personality and internal factors as an explanation of observed events, the Hindu children in India, by contrast, based their explanations more on situations and external factors. This finding is consistent with the idea that some countries, like the United States, emphasize an individualistic self-concept. So, being raised in a society that places a premium on individual achievement and uniqueness, Americans seem to develop a tendency to focus on characteristics of the individual when making attributions.
In a way, we're all psychologists. We look at the people around us and we ask ourselves, why are they acting that way? That, my friend, is attribution, and there's a particular mistake that we usually make when we do it. In psychology, we use the word attribution to mean how we explain other people's behavior. In other words, when we see someone do something, what do we attribute that behavior to? And importantly, psychologists have drawn a line between two types of attribution. On the one hand, there's the dispositional attribution, or sometimes called an internal attribution. However you terminologize it, this is just when you take someone's behavior and say that the reason it happened is something about that person, something in that person's disposition, their personality, their beliefs, their opinions, something about their own set of quirks and traits drove that behavior, caused that behavior. On the other hand, there's the situational attribution or external attribution. And when you make one of these, what you're basically saying is that someone else did what they did, not because of something about them, but because of something about the situation that they were in. Something about the environment, the people around them, the circumstances, any of those things are what caused the behavior ultimately, and not necessarily it being of their own volition. Okay, so what does this look like in the real world? Well, imagine you're at the grocery store and you go up to someone, hopefully someone who works there, and you ask a very simple question. Where are the pickles? And the person just looks at you and rolls their eyes and drearily points down the aisle to where the pickles are at the other end. Now, you could explain this person's snotty response in a couple ways. One, you could say, this is just a real jerk of a person, and I don't think that he's any good at anything, right? That would be a dispositional attribution. You're saying something about that guy and his poor personality and people skills made him react that way. But you could also ask yourself, well, maybe something is going on in this guy's life. Maybe he's distracted. Maybe something horrible just happened, and he's not really in the mood to have a pickle conversation with a stranger today. That would be a situational or external attribution. It's not that this person is a rude guy, it's that something else provoked this response that maybe under other circumstances he would have acted differently. The thing is, even though we have both of these explanations available, we tend to overwhelmingly assume that people's behavior reflects something about them. In other words, we use dispositional attributions all the time, even when a situational attribution might be more appropriate. This is what's called a fundamental attribution error, the fundamental attribution error. And it means that we overlook the possibility that people's behaviors are shaped by their circumstances. We'd rather assume that people do what they do because it is reflective of something about them, rather than coming from something more external. We know this is true because a lot of studies have shown it to be the case. For example, one classic study in the 1960s gave a bunch of people an essay to read, and that essay was either arguing in favor of Fidel Castro or arguing against Fidel Castro. And everyone in the study's job was to guess the author of the essay's true opinion. In other words, the person who wrote this essay, what does he really think? Now, sometimes people were told that the author got to choose which position to take. And not surprisingly, when this is the case, people assume that the author of a pro-Castro essay must be pretty pro-Castro, and the author of an anti-Castro essay is pretty anti-Castro. Not a crazy thing to believe. But where things get more interesting is in the other condition, where the participants were told that the author of this essay had no choice over which position to take. He was literally told he had to write either a pro or an anti-Castro essay. And so rationally, you would take this information and think, well, the essay gives me no information about this person. There's nothing here that I could use to make a judgment about the person's real opinion. And yet, even in this case, people still assumed that when the essay was pro-Castro, that the person writing it must actually be pretty pro-Castro. And when the essay was anti-Castro, the author must have been pretty anti-Castro. The idea here is that even though there was a clear situational explanation for why the author took a particular position, people were still inclined to say that it was driven by something about his real opinions, something about his true personality. So why does this even happen? Well, people have given a lot of different reasons for this, but one that I think makes a lot of sense is the idea that situations are invisible. We see people, we see what they do, but we don't often see the circumstance. We don't see the situational pressures. For example, imagine a man walking through heavy wind. There's a clear situational explanation for why he's walking so weird. It's the wind. But we can't see the wind necessarily. And in the same way, when people are actually influenced by the situations that they're in, we have trouble seeing that influence. So there you go, fundamental attribution error in a nutshell. I have to say, this is one of those topics in social psychology that I think has made me a better person. It's one of those things where when you know we make these kinds of mistakes and errors when we judge other people, it can make you more understanding and open to the fact that people's behavior is driven by all sorts of things, not just the kind of person they are, but the circumstances that they find themselves in. And I think if we can teach ourselves to be open to situational attributions, it might make the world a more understanding place.
I love that ending. So hopefully if there's something that you take away from this lecture, it's that the next time somebody cuts you off in traffic or bumps into you in the store or does something that you find, your initial reaction is to go, oh, what a crappy person they are. Maybe take a step back and challenge yourself to think about the situational or the external attributions that might be at work there. So up next, we are going to talk about social influence. And so we'll cover conformity and obedience. We'll talk about Ash's classic conformity study, and hopefully you'll find it really interesting. So thanks, everyone. I will see you then.